Okay, so this is an audio review of Chapter 13, Qualitative Data Analysis, Searching for Meaning. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the process of qualitative analysis, preparing data in qualitative analysis, identifying concepts, patterns, and relationships, drawing and evaluating conclusions, and variations in qualitative data analysis. Okay, so as every chapter does, this chapter starts by looking at a specific research study to try to put into context what we're going to be talking about, right? So basically, in the example in the book, the broad research question was, what material, interpersonal, and psychological strategies do homeless people use to survive on the streets? So in order to try to answer this, the methodology they chose was based on 1 year of field research among the homeless. And so, Anderson spent 400 hours with 168 homeless individuals in numerous settings, while Snow negotiated access to records and interviewed key officials. So, all that stuff combined, the results generally concerned lifestyles and sense of self and identity. So, trying to understand how people survived, what they found was that maintaining a sense of meaning and self-worth was critical to people's survival. Right? So taking the kind of abstract of how do you turn a research question into results, right? Using this homeless study, we'll kind of come back to this example throughout to talk about how these things work in a practical sense, right? Okay, so before you can do quantitative data analysis, you have to prepare the data. The first step is to transform the data into readable text. So typically we're talking about field notes that you have from your field jottings, which are an informal sketch of the things that you found most relevant. So, for example, my mentor, when he was doing research on Dominican drug robbers, turns out they don't want to be audio recorded so much all the time or have you sitting there with a notebook jotting down notes, because that's weird and awkward. So the more that you can make it conversational and write up these notes later, the better, the kind of more substantive conversations, because people get more comfortable, right? So he would basically talk to his respondents all night, hang out with them for hours. Then he'd go to his car and just kind of jot down some basic notes or basic ideas, themes that he wanted to explore or he found most relevant. He'd go home, go to sleep, and then the next morning he'd take that same jotting and really fill in the kind of blanks between, turning it into a more kind of robust field notes, right? And so with all of those field notes, you put them together day after day, night after night. Once you have compiled a lot of them together, you can start seeing some really interesting patterns, developing some meanings based on what you've observed, right? So another thing that happens too is transforming data into a readable text is transcribing interviews, as interviews are a very common methodological choice within qualitative research, right? So transcribing takes time, right? It's a extremely valuable thing though, because it converts the conversation into data that you can actually then analyze, but doing it by hand, pain in the ass, right? And there's different, software that does that kind of stuff, but it can still be problematic. So, basically you create this. And so, for example, I use, whenever I'm transcribing, I use this software called Dragon. That's a speech to text situation where I basically listen to the audio of an interview in my headphones, and I speak aloud the parts that I'm trying to transcribe, which is all of it, right? Which is annoying as hell, but what can you do? We know that predictive text is just not right. The technology is not quite there yet. It's not like you can just record an interview and think it'll just pick up all the words, especially because the English language is so complicated, right? And context matters, spellings, all sorts of, homonyms and things that are similar. So anyway, transcribing it, if you do a 1 hour interview, that's about 7 hours of typing up a 1 hour interview. So using some sort of software like the one I use takes about 3.5 hours off of that time. So yeah, it's still kind of cumbersome, which is why people don't interview like lots and lots of people often. So once you have it into a readable text, then you check for and resolve any errors. So team researchers have to really check each other's notes, because in larger projects, you have multiple people working on these things. and they have to agree on the subjective categories and in general what happened, right? Having another person look at it can really fill in the gaps that might be missing in one person's write-up, right, or in their field notes. And then when it comes to the interviews, you want to compare the transcription with the audio recording of the interview. So again, just to make sure there weren't errors in the transcription process. So, having to do these things manually is tough, but sometimes even the software I use, it's not going to be correct. The one I like, or the one I use, I like because it gets used to your speech patterns and the kind of words that you're using. But still, that if you have that kind of option on your phone where you can get like a voicemail as a text, that it's all sorts of wrong, right? It's not at all what the person said in the message. So, or if you think about how often autocorrect can ruin your text messages, right? You don't want the data to be as bad as a bad text or flawed because you're going to use it as the basis of interpretation. So if your whole research is based on it, you don't want it to be flawed. So you got to check. And then you got to manage the data. So it may be organized by attribute coding, which is just when you code characteristics of participants, settings, or other phenomena. So it's an important step that is sometimes more straightforward than you would think, because depending on the research design, your questions and what they're asking about may lead to this coding. But you basically just group responses around similar themes, so it's easier to manage and interpret. So we'll talk more about coding in a moment. So then you store the data in a physical or electronic filing system. So typically you're not putting this in a file cabinet, you're putting it in a computer, right? That's not open to people outside of the research project. So this also makes its way into the informed consent later when you talk about how you protect the raw data information. All right, so when we're talking about fixing the errors, looking for the errors, this is some examples here, right, of how you have what the transcriber typed over here on the left, and then you have what the interviewee actually said. And so these things can sound very similar, like it just makes sense or it doesn't make sense. When you're listening to an audio and quickly going through and typing it up, like here you see, what they typed was mixed service when they meant lip service, right? These things have a huge meaning difference. And so think about it. The more and more errors you have like that, the more you're flawed in what information you're kind of cataloging. It could mess up your codes, your themes. It could mess up kind of just the way you can interpret the information. So it's incredibly important, even when you've gone through the process, typed it all up, to go through, sit there and listen to it, double check, make sure that it's actually reflective. Because again, you're going to use it, so you want to make sure it's right. So coding is the process of labeling and organizing your qualitative data to identify different themes and relationships between them. So the unit of analysis may vary. It could be events, places, or individuals in the field research. And it may be transcript lines for interviews. So you're going to ask questions of the data that helps determine what to code. So the specifics of your code are a reflection of the data itself. So it's always good to go back to your research questions or your hypotheses in order to guide your analysis of the data. You find out a lot of information, and some of it is less related to the topics under analysis. So for example, once when I was doing research, I remember a couple of my respondents talked about their politics in relation to war and drones and all that kind of fun stuff, which had absolutely nothing to do with what the scope of my research was, right? And while it was super interesting to me, it wasn't relevant enough a finding to include in my results and discussion section. So you're basically deep in the weeds with your data. So you have to focus on what makes the most sense in relation to what your study is actually looking for. So coding categories are a grouping you impose on the coded segments you found in order to reduce the amount or number of pieces of data in your analysis. So if you're looking at a code of people in public life, you could divide it into coding categories like politicians, celebrities, news anchors, etc. So coding categories may be realms of meaning and activity. So in the Homeless Study, they talked about, different domains like cultural domains, self and identity in their own coding categories. And even those coding categories themselves can be broken down even further, right? So that there's coding categories are just a segment of your code that's then further broken down and organized for meanings and relationships, right? As they did in the example in your book, right? Where they broke down cultural domains into self and identity, drugs, food and eating, and so forth, right? Or how they broke down self and identity into forms of identity talk, right? To kind of almost like branch out and further clarify the meanings of the things that you're examining. Another process that's important are memos. So what the hell are those? Memos are just personal reflections on the research experience, methodological issues, or patterns in the data. So it's kind of a way to organize your thoughts through the experience. So the memos are basically mini analyses of what you think you're learning during the course of your evaluation. So they're written during and after the data collection, and they can be summaries of your major findings, or they can be comments like, oh, today was really hard, or, the interviews were difficult because of this or that, or whatever it might be, right? And the reflections on particular aspects of your evaluation, things that you think will be helpful later when you're trying to kind of put this all together, right? And so this is often used in conjunction with coding itself. So code memos describe the basis of coding categories as in a code book. So just like in the quantitative analysis we talked about, codes need to be organized and sorted for replication, for explanation in your methods. And so it's essential in situations where research teams are working together on a study, because you want to make sure they're actually all looking at the same thing, measuring it the same way, right? So code memos identify the code labels and their meanings, which is important because most of the terms we use in sociological research methods are, we use them with technical meanings, but they also have meanings in the everyday language. So it's essential to write down a clear account of what you mean by the codes you're using in your analysis. All right, moving on to data displays. So there's different ways to do this as well. You got taxonomy, you got data matrix, and typologies, right? So taxonomy is just a system of ordered classification. Basically, it's a list that organizes the categories you've developed in the research. So let me show you the example they have here, right? The taxonomy here is this guy right here, where you can see that you have a kind of organized outline or list that's broken down in kind of a strategic way that's ordering or classifying the information that you're looking at, right? So, over here you have shadow work. What does that mean? It's broken down into subcategories, and then for instance, scavenging as a subcategory. What does scavenging mean for food, for goods, for money, etc.? So even though you are saying these are the kind of overall themes, you're looking at maybe these three, you then break them down, and then you break them down further to further clarify, right? So the taxonomy is just kind of like a visual representation of that. So let me go back to talk about these other ones. And in a data matrix, individuals or other units represent columns, and coding categories represent rows. So it's a way to tabulate the observations researchers see in the research. It's a bit tedious as you go person by person or case by case and enter in the criteria into the data matrix. So to point that out, right, over here we got the data matrix. So you can see that, the representation in one variable category is what we're looking at here, right? So you have kind of the way they've coded it here. And you see it's going to give you an example for each person, right? So individual 1, 0, individual 2, 0. Individual 3, 1, individual 4, 2. So you basically would go through, this is just for one variable right here, but for the full data matrix, you would fill in for each individual every different variable criteria that you're looking at, right? Which again, like I said, it seems pretty damn tedious, but you fill all of them in to complete the data matrix. And then once you have all of it in there, the participant's information is visible to you. You can better compare cases and look for relationships and patterns, right? And then typologies. These are representations of findings based on the interrelationship between two or more ideas or maybe variables, concepts, right? So it's long-winded, but another way to organize the data so you can better see relationships between your concepts and really the responses of the people in the research. So back to the textbook example, right? The researchers developed a typology to understand the homeless people they were researching. So the categories are related but distinct categories within a phenomenon you're looking at that divides the phenomena into categories again. So for the purpose of organization, this is also you can better determine relationships and aid in the kind of theory development part later on, right? So in this example, they have, their typology of outsiders, of, straddlers, and how they kind of break those down into subcategories, right? So of their subcategory of bums, they have traditional or redneck, right? Things like tramps, traditional or hippie, right? Fun stuff. So the typology itself, again, is just a better way to further categorize and understand the information. And then flowcharts, I'll just skip ahead to what that looks like. These are diagrams that display the processes that are, of course, a form of concept mapping, which is the graphic display of concepts and their intertwined relationships. And this is very important because it helps you develop that theory later on about what those relationships are. So you kind of see the directionality of the relationships, right? Not just what they are, but you see which ones are related to each other, in what directions they're related to each other, right? How some inform others and are contingent upon others. And so again, this helps you later explain with theory what relationships between, the variables or the concepts you're looking at in your research. Alrighty, drawing and evaluating conclusions. Okay, so conclusions may result in rich descriptions. So this is important in qualitative research. The description provides meaning and needs to be robust and complex so that the reader is in the social location that you're studying, or is in the perspective of the people being analyzed, or so that the meanings are illustrated for the reader, right? So identification of themes is another important thing. This organizes the more subjective observations into clear, meaningful themes that focus the theoretical analysis. So then you make inferences about empirical patterns and concepts that, relate to your specific research questions. And then you have your own theoretical propositions for what you think is happening, right? So you see that there's a relationship between these two variables. How do you explain that, right? That's when you make your own theoretical proposition to say, well, based on feminist theory, I think that blah, 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 right? Or maybe you're basing it on an existing theory in a grounded kind of approach, or you're questioning or adapting a theory, right? So a lot of this is just trying to develop a way to explain the phenomena that you're witnessing, right? So also when it comes to a lot of these things, you're going to compare notes in collaborative research, obviously, because the more people involved, you want to make sure that you're measuring in the same way and that you're having the same conclusions of what you're looking at, right? Also, when there's situations where you're using multiple sources of data, obviously you want to kind of pull those things together to look at how they inform each other, right? So maybe, like as you saw within the homeless study, there was researchers really looking at it very differently, right? Some looking at more of the structural aspects, some looking more at the actual individual interview aspects of, the daily lived experiences. So when you combine those things together, you can understand it in a more robust way. Also, it's important to examine exceptions to patterns in the data. Like, what is it about this person that makes them an outlier? Or is this maybe questionable to the validity of that pattern, right? It's important to kind of look at those exceptions to the rule. And then member checking, maybe asking participants if the data makes sense to them, right? Making sure that the way that people were represented is actually a reflection of how they feel. All right, so variations in qualitative analysis. Grounded theory is pretty popular, right? This is the objective in grounded theory is to develop a theory from the data. So it's an inductive approach to research in which theories are generated solely from an examination of the data rather than being derived deductively like quantitative analysis does. So it emphasizes people's actions and voices as the sources of data. So people are the data. So what they do and what they say is the focus of the analysis. And so your book talks about, action coding, in vivo coding. These are just different ways to, kind of interpret these sources of data. So in vivo coding is coding incorporating participants' own words, right? So maybe using their specific quotes as a way to frame things. And action coding is more about looking at, signaling activity based on those kind of overall themes that are coming out of what people are saying. So, making comparisons is really important throughout this process. So they use theoretical sampling typically to get participants, and memo writing also facilitates advanced analysis, meaning that it's not just the coding itself, it's also the writing of how the research was experienced and how maybe interpreted as it was going on and after the fact that really informs how you then develop the theory for what you're looking at. So there is an example in the book of action process coding, which breaks down an interview statement and shows you how the initial coding looks for themes and goes through that interview statement, and then how once you have those initial themes, you've done that for all your different interviews, it's much easier to kind of compare and contrast them so you can develop kind of larger analyses. All right, variations in qualitative analysis. First, you got narrative analysis. So the objective in narrative analysis is to examine the structure, meaning, and other characteristics of stories. So it's a genre that uses analytic frames where researchers interpret stories that are told within the context of research or are shared in everyday life. So it's used to analyze literary works as well. Sorry, I'm moving on to conversation before I even finish it, but it's used to analyze literary works, interviews, other data. So they look at elements like how the story is structured, what functions the story serves, what the substance of the story is, and how the story is performed. So it's used in conjunction with life history interviews and is something seen in the field of historical sociology, as text can be used to help us understand meanings in a particular time period, like what arguments were popular or what opinions or views were widely held in a historical era. So I think these are really interesting and have an interesting application. And the data that you pull from is very diverse because it's related to the time period, but it can be something pretty, prodigious now because there's so many different sources that tell a story, like books, films, comics, basically anything that tells a story. Conversation analysis is a meticulous analysis of the details of a conversation based on a complete transcript that includes pauses, hems, and haws, right? How often you get to talk about hems and haws. So every word has a meaning, and often the absence of words or where a person pauses actually matters to the meaning of what they're trying to say as well. So the objective in conversation analysis is to analyze the structure, sequencing, word choice, and other characteristics of conversations. So it could be based on a video or audio recording, right? You use the transcription. They use a detailed shorthand notation to indicate the speaker's pauses or silences, things like that. And then there's an example in the book where they used a 911 call as the basis for this conversation analysis, which is interesting. So you can see how they, kind of have a systematic way of explaining the pauses or the ums and all this kind of noises that people make when they're trying to speak, especially in a situation like that. It's pretty interesting with something like a 911 call that has very practical applications, especially for something like criminological understandings. Like, for example, in some questionable death investigations, they'll listen to the 911 call to indicate whether a person was, the perpetrator themselves, right? Or they look at things like, what did they say? What words did they use? The cadence and pitch of their voice to determine if it's genuine. But obviously that's not the context of the one in the book, but really just how it's so important to look at what people said, what order they said it in, all of that to really develop a deeper understanding of the meanings of what they're saying, right? And so it's interesting because we don't talk about it much, but oftentimes it's what people don't say that can often be interesting as much as what people do say. So conversation analysis really does a deep dive on this. And these are just, a couple different variations of qualitative analysis of ways to kind of analyze the social world from that qualitative point of view.